debate brought to you by CER, the Center on Regulation in Europe. My name is Sally Broughton-Mitsova. I'm a lecturer at the University of East Anglia, and I am a fellow at CER as well. Today, our topic is online content moderation. As many of you will remember, in February of this year, the European Commission set out a vision for a digital future, part of which was strengthening responsibilities and rules for online platforms. Now, I would say things probably started moving in that direction with the revision of the Audio Visual Media Services Directive already in 2018, when we saw member states required to ensure video sharing platforms took responsibility for protecting consumers from harmful content and behavior in a way similar to audiovisual media. And now the Digital Services Act is the core element of this project. And along with it, some might say a long-awaited re-examination of the liability exemptions for online services in the e-commerce directive. And of course, the context for all of this are some serious concerns about the consequences of the proliferation of harmful content, even illegal content, and behavior online. So today we're going to focus on perhaps the most important element of sort of how platforms may take responsibility, and that is moderating the content that they are carrying. First, we're going to hear from our CER Joint Academic Director, Professor Alexandre Destreel. He's going to be sharing with us recommendations from a report that he and colleagues just recently finished for IMCO Committee of the European Parliament, exactly on online platforms moderation of illegal content online. And after this, we're going to be hearing from MEP Tiemo Wölken. He is the rapporteur for the initiative report on the DSA. And then we will have a response from Werner Stengg. He is a cabinet member in Executive Vice President Vestager's cabinet, at the heart of the policy making around the DSA. So after the presentation, we will have time for questions. So I encourage all of you to share questions as they come, as you think of them. Feel free to share questions on Slido using the event code #CERDigital, and our team will be gathering these questions and then feeding them to me so that I can put them into the discussion after the debate. And I ask all the participants to keep your mics off while you're not speaking so that we can avoid any background interruptions. Alexandre, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Here the idea is to present a report that I did with some colleague at the University of Namur and also at VVA on illegal content moderation. So as it has been said by Sally before, really the focus of this report is on illegal content and not so much on harmful content. And I want to do that in to summarize the main findings of the report in 4 points. So we think that any regulation or any reform of the e-commerce directive should be based on a certain number of good governance principles. And then on the basis of those principles, to have two different regimes, a baseline regime for, the minimum regime if you want, and then maybe some stricter regime where the risk of illegal content is higher. And then there is always the issue of enforcement, which is often a weak point in the EU law. So first thing, and I think that is relatively, I would guess, non-controversial, but it's always good to remember with on which principle you should base any legislation. The first and one of the most important principles is to respect fundamental rights. We know that there is a series of fundamental rights which are at play here. Freedom of expression, of course, which is an extremely important fundamental right, but then you have other fundamental rights, and the point is to ensure a good protection and a good balance among those rights. A second very important issue is to build internal market. We see that more and more some member states are adopting specific law regarding some time of illegal content, and that is obviously may create a problem for the internal market, because many of the platforms which are hosting those content are global or European, and so it would be not necessarily a good thing for internal market if very different rules are applicable in different member states. The third very important principle is the principle of level playing field. Level playing field between online and offline. So what is illegal offline should also be illegal online, and technological neutrality, and also a business model neutrality. That's very important as well. So in a way, the law should not favor a specific technology or specific business model over another. The fourth principle, which is very important as well, is that the law gives the right incentive to the different players to minimize the cost, to minimize the risk of error, of either removing too much, so removing a content which is not illegal, or removing too little, not removing some illegal content. So it's very important that we think about the incentive that the rules are creating for the different stakeholders. Then there is the principle of proportionality and coherence among legal instruments. In fact, the EU legal framework on online illegal content is very complex. We have several directives and possibly regulation, and it's very important that there is a coherence among all of those, and then that all of that is effectively enforced. So what we say in our report is that the baseline scenario, so the scenario which should be applicable for every platform independently of their content, the content they carry, should maybe have a bit more procedural accountability rule than currently in Article 14 of the e-commerce directive. And for that, we think that the Commission recommendation, the recommendation that the European Commission adopted 2 years ago now, and the reform of the audiovisual media service directive that Sally mentioned is probably a good way forward. And maybe we should generalize what has been done for video sharing platform for every online platform, and we should put into the hard law a good principle that you find in the Commission recommendation. And so that means what in practice? That means possibly to have a system of notice and action and notice and take down at the European level. We know that this was something which was left a bit in the e-commerce directive. No, some member states have a specific law on that, but there is nothing specifically at the European level. And I'm very happy that the MEP that we have with us here, Wölken, has a very good idea on that. And then also that if the platform take a preventive measure to alleviate that some illegal content are on their platform, they are not disincentivized to do that. And so, for instance, we could introduce a kind of good Samaritan clause into the law. No, we know that some people say it's already there, others say not, but clearly, I mean, there is an unclarity in the e-commerce directive today. The other thing which is very important, if the platform are using preventive measure, is that very often now they are using artificial intelligence to do that. And it's probably the only way, because there are so many content that needs to be moderate that, I mean, you have to possibly use AI. So the problem is not AI, but the problem is what kind of safeguard you impose on the platform which are using AI. And that at the end of the day, at the end of the loop, you should always have a human which is there if there is a problem. And at the end of the day, it should always be a court of a state which is taking a decision of what is legal and what is illegal. But we know that some platform or some content have a higher risk for the society. So what we are arguing in the report is to have two sort of differentiation of rules, or if you want, a stricter rule in two cases. The first is already there in EU law, is to have a differentiation according to the type of illegal content. In the sense that for the illegal content which have the highest potential negative impact on the society, the rule needs to be stricter. And that's what we have for terrorism content, and there is still a negotiation pending on that, for child sexual abuse, or for some form of hate speech. So this is a differentiation that we have already in EU law, and we think it makes perfect sense. On the other hand, the other differentiation we don't have yet in EU law, and that is a differentiation according to the size of the platform. So if you are a bigger platform, your potential negative impact is, everything else equal, higher, because you target more players. And this is why, in fact, in some national law, you have indeed a threshold for some stricter rule. So what we call public space content sharing platform. So the very, very big platform should, according to us, be subject to more extensive procedural obligations. So, for instance, they should publish transparency report on what they have done. So some are doing now. So it's not necessarily reinventing the wheel to do that, but they are doing voluntary. What we think is that we should have now in EU law a differentiation according to the size of the platform, and in a way to create a symmetric rule for the biggest platform. And finally, you may remember this quote, it's the economy is stupid, that is attributed to Bill Clinton, or to at least an advisor of Bill Clinton when he made its campaign. It's the economic stupid for a US election, but in Europe, very often the problem is enforcement. So in a way, you have very good law which are adopted by the Parliament and the Council under the proposal of the Commission, but then the enforcement is left to the member states authorities, and it's not always done well. So, the enforcement issue is a very complex issue because you have several ways of enforcing a law. One is thanks to state authorities, and in particular, thanks to national regulatory authority. And we know that with the VMS directive, now the transposition of the directive, many media regulators will have a new role in enforcing online content moderation rule. But the main point that we want to make in the report is that for the biggest platform, we should have a differentiated enforcement system. So we think it should be either an EU authority or at least a very close cooperation between national authority for the biggest one. Okay, it should not be only the country, the authority of the country where a platform is established. We know that already today, some of the biggest platforms are established either in Ireland or in Luxembourg. And so, to ask to the authority of those countries to police the platform for all Europe seems to us not necessarily the best approach. So yes, it's a good approach for the small platform that they are regulated only by the authority of their country where they are established. But for the biggest one, maybe we need to think at another system. Now, we understand that this proposal may be controversial, but I think it's worth discussing. And then we think also that private enforcement, so if a victim goes before a national court, a private enforcement could be facilitated. We have several suggestions in that regard. Regarding now enforcement with private body, and they are very important in the sector. We have a lot of self and co-regulation, and we think that's a good thing because, some issues are complex, some issues are new, and so you have to involve the stakeholders and the platform into the regulation. But we think that possibly additional safeguard for self and co-regulation should be in the law, in particular in making some code of conduct or in monitoring some code of conduct. Again, this is what we have now in the new AVMS directive, and this is what we think could be generalized in a new e-commerce directive. So to conclude, I think the two main messages that we have in our report for the European Parliament is first, more responsibility or more procedural accountability for everyone. That will ensure a better protection of the user online while safeguarding the fundamental right, and also more differentiation according to content that we have it already today, but also differentiation according to platform and the size of the platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Now we're going to hear from Tiemo. Do you have anything to share? Feel free to share your screen if you need to. Otherwise, just let us know. We're eager to hear the good ideas that Alexander has mentioned.
Yeah, no, I didn't have something to share. I just, speak. I hope that's okay. I mute my speakers to avoid an echo. Just kidding. Okay. So, where can I start? Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Obviously, I think it's a very busy week for a more digital European Union, and I'm really happy to see Werner here, although I can imagine he is quite busy at the moment. First of all, thanks again to Alex for the presentation of the study, and especially for the policy recommendations. And to be honest, I'm relieved to find out that my proposal for the DSA initiative report in the JURI Committee goes more or less in the same direction as the recommendations made in the study. So maybe we have done something right. I would like to use my time to briefly take you through the main elements of my report and use this chance to point out the areas in which my report follows the policy recommendations we just heard. So firstly, I'm very pleased that the study calls for an increased focus on procedural accountability. Rather than encouraging content moderation via the liability of platforms for illegal content, I believe this is to be a good way to ensure the respect of fundamental rights and especially prevent overblocking. And I'm very, very happy that the conversation this time really is about fundamental rights, and fundamental rights are taken more and more into account. I think this is a good way. My report calls for a regulation establishing procedural rules for notice and action mechanism in line with the recommendations made by the study. So far, all content management procedures have developed as measures taken by platforms in reaction to the liability regime laid down in the e-commerce directive. And while the e-commerce directive contains important principles, such as the limitations to liability and the ban of general monitoring obligations, we are now realizing that when platforms take measures to reduce liability risks, the procedural safeguards that guarantee legal certainty and fundamental rights are missing. This is why I propose to enshrine these procedural rules in a standalone regulation to ensure that procedural safeguards are binding and enforceable. And I was also pleased to see that the recommendations call for a differentiated approach in dealing with illegal content on one hand and content that is harmful but legal on the other. The study makes good recommendations such as promoting counter speech and encouraging the availability of relevant content. On this point, my report makes recommendations that address the link between the economic interest of platforms to raise profits from targeted personalized advertisements and the content curation practices of platforms that determine the visibility of certain content to individual users. I believe that as long as platforms boost the visibility of content that is particularly likely to generate clicks due to its attention-seeking nature, we will see prevalence of harmful content on our timelines. My proposal to address this is to introduce stricter rules on targeted advertising, as well as giving users more control over the content curation criteria that determine what content is shown to them. And I'm really happy to see, for example, Twitter now progressing and already giving users the choice. This can be done via an application programming interface that can allow third-party services to offer custom-made curation algorithms that prioritize content according to other criteria than their profile, which the platform made from previous behavior. And this could also facilitate the entry of a multitude of new services to the digital single market. One point where I'm a little bit more hesitant is the encouragement of proactive measures, such as the Good Samaritan clause. I think one of the beneficial effects of laying down procedural standards for content moderation is precisely to ensure safeguards and a harmonized approach. I believe encouraging platforms to take voluntary measures can incentivize overblocking and take us a step back. This is particularly the case when it comes to the use of automated tools. The suggestion to link these to the requirements of artificial intelligence is interesting, but already the first requirement listed in the recommendations is human agency and oversight. So automated ex-ante control mechanism that block content before it is uploaded makes human agency and oversight impossible. So we need to be very careful about encouraging this approach. But on the other hand, I am calling for a European agency to look into algorithms, and other reports in the parliament also do it. So I think, or at least the drafts do it. Let's see what happens during the negotiations with the shadow rapporteurs. But I see there is clearly a link. So I could imagine an agency or EU body which is capable of performing this kind of oversight, not only in the DSA, but also for AI. So I don't think we need a special agency for each and every sector, but maybe a European body doing or overseeing different areas. Yeah, all in all, I think that the discussion among policy makers, researchers, and civil society on the DSA are very constructive. So maybe we learned a lot from the copyright battle, and there is a broad consensus on how the regimes governing online content moderation should be updated. Of course, some groups may have different views on specific points, but overall, there are no major disruptions so far. We have had 4 shadow meetings and for my report, and I think 2 or 3 technical meetings, and we have reached agreements on general provisions and recitals, provisions on smart contracts, on the content curation, advertising, data interoperability, as well as on the oversight by a European regulator. After the summer break, we will discuss the procedural details called for in the notice and action procedures and reach an overall agreement on terminology and definitions. This will give us the chance to address the question of proportionality, and differentiating between types of platforms. There is an agreement that larger platforms with a stronger influence in the market are particularly relevant, and I very much appreciate that the study also refers to them as being a public space. On the other hand, there is a strong call to ensure that procedural obligations are proportional and appropriate for small and medium enterprises and startups. We will have the vote on the report on the 28th of September, with a plenary vote aimed for in October. Given that the Commission is planning to present the legislative proposal on the DSA at the end of the year, the time frames are quite tight, but we will do our utmost possible to send our signal towards the Commission. So I'm really glad to see that the Commission is actively taking part in all the conversations, yeah, we can, I think, make sure that all stakeholders are involved. So I'm now very much looking forward to hear the comments of Werner, and of course I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, and sorry for being 1 minute over my time.
No problem. Thank you very much, Tiemo. Before we give the word to Werner to respond to both of these, Alexander, do you want to come in on this issue of the Good Samaritan comment that Tiemo has made, or on anything else that he said?
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe on one or two things. So first, on the issue of linking the economic interest in the content moderation, I think that's really key. I mean, we always have to see what are the incentives of the company to do things, and I think the best law is the law which managed to give the right incentive instead of policing directly the behavior. So I really like a lot that idea in the report, and I think also more thinking sometimes in the academic environment could be done on that. On the proactive measure and the Good Samaritan, I mean, of course, that's a difficult issue. The only question I have is, could we rely only on a notice in action system, even an improved one, as you suggest, to ensure that internet is safe of harmful, illegal, and also harmful content? And that is, that's the trick. So I think that could not be enough. So clearly, I think we need some proactive measure. But I see your point that that is raising a higher risk for fundamental right than non-proactive measure. And I think we should maintain the idea that there is no general monitoring to be done. But I'm not sure that without any proactive measure we can. That would be enough. A last element on the type of platform, as you say, I think when we were doing the report, we realized that in fact all the platform law in Europe is symmetric. The e-commerce is symmetric. The AVMS to some extent is symmetric, although there you can see a proportionality principle there. The GDPR is symmetric. The platform to business is symmetric. And that is strange, because we are in an environment where you have some extremely good, extremely big and good also a platform, and a lot of small platform. And to have the same law all over, it may backfire, as you just said. And there are now some findings that the GDPR is in fact protecting the big players against the small. I mean, I didn't do this kind of research myself, but I think it's very important when we think about the DSA not to have only symmetric law and also symmetric enforcement, because really I'm not sure that an authority of one country has the ability and the incentive to police a platform for whole Europe. It's just, I mean, it's not a value judgment on the authority. It's again an issue of incentive. And that's a question we should ask ourselves. Has the Irish regulator the incentive to police Facebook or Google or YouTube for whole Europe? I mean, that's a question. I don't have an answer, but I think it's worth questioning that. And maybe if the answer is no, then we should have a European authority, the Commission, or something more European than just the country of establishment.
Okay, we have some questions coming in, and I'm gathering them now. Again, if you have some questions for our participants, you can share them on Slido. The event code is #SAREDigital. That's Sarah with 2 R's, as you see in the logo behind my name, behind my head. But now I'm going to give the floor to Werner so that he can give some comments, and then I hope we will come back to some of these issues about proactive measures or not, oversight, European level versus national level, etc. Werner, please turn yourself on and share with us your thoughts.
Yes, hello everybody, and many thanks for hosting this event and also for the 2 good presentations. As Tiemo rightly said, there is a lot of convergence emerging, which is very encouraging because this debate is complicated, it's important, it's sensitive. We have been talking about these issues for a long time, and now it's about time to find the right solutions. But there, as I said, I think we are going very much in the same direction. Starting with some things from the first presentation. Of course, we can't forget that the DSA deals with all types of illegal activities, because there's a lot of focus here on fundamental rights, which is super important. But here we are very often immediately in the debate about hate speech and freedom of expression and so on. The DSA is even more complicated than that, because it will have to cater for all types of services for all types of activities, for all types of risks that can be associated with those activities. And that's the first step in our exercise, really, that we have to identify what type of services do we have today that we didn't have 20 years back. What are the risks that can be associated with them? And that can be anything from an unsafe product that is placed on our market to terrorism, to child sexual abuse, to hate speech, and even harmful content, where, by the way, I fully agree with Tiemo that that this should not be part of the DSA. There should not be a notice and takedown regime and obligation for the removal of something that is not illegal. So focus obviously on anything illegal, but still differentiate between the different types of activities, different type of risks. And from that comes then the identification of the responsibilities that we would want to impose on those providing those services, the due processes, the risk mitigation measures that we expect from those services. And again, I fully agree with Tiemo when he says that it is good to focus on procedural accountability rather than have a liability discussion, which leads us directly into all the fundamental rights and overblocking discussions. So let's rather sit down and see what we would expect a diligent operator to do to protect users, if you want. At the same time, of course, we need to be very careful that we prevent over-removal, that we protect fundamental rights. And we've always said that it's the two things that we want. We want to address illegal content and activities, but we also want to make sure that legal content stays online. And if it is removed erroneously, that there are checks and balances in place, that things can be challenged and get online again. So again, full agreement on that. Third objective also from the presentation, obviously very important for us, the digital single market, but the single market dimension of all of this. If we address these new phenomena and risks, we have to address them in a uniform European way. Otherwise, we see even more of the fragmentation, of which we have already seen quite a lot. And if we want digital services to be fully developed and used in Europe, there needs to be a set of European rules that also allows companies to grow and scale up in Europe to the extent that they provide us with the reassurance that their services are properly managed. There is a level playing field dimension in this, as was mentioned. For instance, just to take one example, if those unsafe products that I mentioned, products that do not meet our safety standards and product standards, come on our market, they're obviously in direct competition with legitimate products that come on our market. And that may be offline companies, but also other online companies. It's not always just an online versus offline debate. It is just a question of level playing field, that a product, a service that is offered on the European market needs to comply with our rules. And that is also one of the objectives, of course, of the digital single market. I would add to that also legal certainty, because if I'm a business, if I leave the commission, have a brilliant idea for a startup and create some sort of intermediation service, probably today I would not quite know what my legal risks are. What is really the framework? What is allowed? What is not allowed? What is active? What is passive? What is this, that, and the other? So I think we need legal certainty, and we need this on a European scale. Second remark. On enforcement, and both gentlemen spoke about that. That's absolutely critical, because one of the problems of today is not that there's always a lack of rules, but it's the enforcement that has become so much more difficult. And that's why we have to find ways in which we can improve that. So if I spoke about those unsafe products on our market, they are not legal, obviously, because they don't meet our laws, but it's very hard for law enforcement, for market surveillance authorities, for customs authorities, whoever, to get hold of those products. And even if they do get hold of the products, to find the trader that is behind those products. So we need to look for ways in which we can make sure that our existing rules and laws can be complied with and enforced also in the online world. And there we're looking into the whole range of options, and whether or not at some stage some centralized body will be needed will very much depend on the assessment where the current system is too weak, where we cannot just solve the problem by improving existing structures, improving the cooperation between authorities, also between countries. when some of the obligations in the final version of the DSA are such that you need a specific expertise or competence, then probably we will need to be creative about enforcement solutions. But that really comes then once we know what roles we actually want to enforce. Probably just a final word on the Good Samaritan clause, since we had a discussion on this, and Tiemo said he was skeptical to a certain extent. First of all, for us, that is not now a new safe harbor idea, because every operator would be subject to the same, not necessarily the same, but would be subject to duties of care, if you want, take measures like notice and takedown procedures to manage their platforms. Now, if any platform for their own sake says, well, but we are going to use additional mechanisms. We want, for, I don't know, for reputational risks, or because we are good corporate citizens, we want to use additional technologies to monitor our space, that should be possible. I don't think this is per se an encouragement for over removal, but we do want to prevent a situation where the mere fact that you use such systems already takes you out of the current safe harbor. So it's not a new safe harbor if, in spite of all your systems, you become aware of illegal content. You have to act expeditiously, but it's not because you have systems in place that you will be punished. And last comment on this, since we're also planning to have much more transparency and accountability about the systems themselves, content moderation systems, how they operate, what their outcomes are. I think we also capture this concern of Tiemo's that where systems are being used in such a way that a lot of stuff is removed that should never have been removed, that hopefully can also be captured by additional transparency and accountability mechanisms. There's much more to say, but for this first reaction, I leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Werner. It sounds like there's quite a lot of agreement among the three of you. So hopefully in the discussion we can challenge you a little bit and create a little bit of controversy here. And on that, I want to push you on this before I get to some questions we have. The AVMSD has a essentially three-tiered approach that is fundamentally based on the extent to which the audience members or users can control their own exposure to content. So linear is different from video on demand, and video sharing platforms are treated differently. So why make it size, right? You seem to have equated size and publicness and the level of responsibility being different based on size. And I'm wondering, why is that connection between size and publicness? And are we not then at risk of leaving out other places where people might be harmed? And is not a lot of the really illegal content actually happening and being disseminated on the margins in smaller, less public online spaces anyway? So I'm going to throw that one out for you first, and then I'll go to some questions. Alexander, do you want to?
Yeah, but no, I mean, the point is not to say that only the big platform can do harm. So yes, indeed, I mean, on very small platform, you can have some specific content which is extremely harmful. And in fact, that's what happened. So, but as I said, everything else equal, if you are a very, very big platform, you tend to be part of the public space. I mean, it's not anymore just a private space run by a private company. It's a public space run by a private company. And I have no problem with that as such. But the thing is that then you need to impose, I mean, some different rule. When you run a public space, you in a way, it's a bit like the rule that we have on the universal service provider in several network industries. I mean, it's a private company, so there is no problem to that. But then they have higher rule, because a higher obligation responsibility, because they have a higher, a higher role in the society. So that's the point. But that do not mean that a very small platform should have no obligation at all because it's small.
Does anyone else want to come in on this? Shall I go, Werner?
Yes, indeed. And I would pretty much echo what Alexandra just said, because we are also, of course, experimenting with this. So it's one of the issues we're consulting on. Does size matter, and does would size lead to more obligations than if you are small? And once again, it's not black and white and saying no obligations for small, all the obligations for big. This is part of the broader risk assessment exercise, if you want, right? And that may lead to very different results for different types of content. Yeah, we had these discussions before. There may be types of content where indeed a lot of harm can be done by very small and niche operators. For others, the size would really also be a function of its reach, and the impact that it would have would indeed depend on size. When we're talking, let me take an extreme example. If you're saying there is a risk of manipulation of elections, these sort of things, I think we can safely assume that this risk is much higher if you have the reach of the very, very large social media platforms. So if on top of the rules that would apply to anybody else, we say, well, for those particular types of platforms, there will be 2 or 3 extra transparency reporting cooperation obligations, whatever it is, that would be matching the risks that we have identified, right? So big could lead to more obligations, but that doesn't mean small is out, and it doesn't mean that all big is always bad.
Okay. I have a question here where we're talking about measures. I have a question from the audience here. Why are proactive measures only understood to be moderation? What about minimum preventive measures? I think on that topic, I think you'd have to draw a line between what is moderation and what is preventive. I've been spending a lot of time looking at transparency reports from some of these big video sharing platforms, and most of the content is actually essentially prevented. It is moderated, flagged and moderated by artificial intelligence before it is even observed by users. And yes, so is that content moderation? What kind of oversight do we need to have on these kinds of things that aren't even actually getting yet to the public? I'll give one example. Facebook, in their transparency report, they have a comparison between what was flagged and removed based on their AI and compare it with human flagging, and they're sort of claiming to have bridged the gap between what their human flag and what their AI is flagging. And they also report on the number of complaints and how those complaints are resolved. Is that kind of a thing enough for us to assess their procedural, their process? And what do we think about this kind of preventive moderation? Werner? You can leave your mics on now, I think, as we're doing this debate, and feel free to just wave and jump in.
All right. Well, the way you describe it, I would certainly say we should cover the whole universe. When we talk about more transparency and more accountability, of course, it is not just what happened in response to some notice, so in terms of result of notice and takedown, but it's the whole systems that are in place that decide on what type of content will appear on a platform, what will stay on a platform, what will disappear from the platform. So if we're saying that, especially for coming back to the larger platforms, especially for large social media platforms, we would want much more information on the way in which decisions are taken to deal with content. And that obviously includes already this first stage where automated systems would be used to decide what things that would not even once appear on that platform. I think this is pretty much in line with everything we have said before. It's also when we speak about transparency of algorithmic systems, also in the AI context, in the white paper on artificial intelligence, we always talk about the transparency about black box systems that may have great impact on us users, right? And if, because the bridge is not far from algorithms to artificial intelligence, if there was a system in place that would systematically, I'm fantasizing now, yeah, but would systematically remove all content coming from an ethnic group, or everything that a man posts is being removed, which is happening all the time. In that case, of course, we would want more accountability, more transparency. So my answer, how we do this and how exactly we formulate this requirement and how granular this transparency reporting would be and how we would be able to enforce it, that's yet another question. But in terms of objectives, I'm completely with you.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, just shortly or briefly, I really think if we are talking about preventive measures as more transparency, I totally agree. So more transparency would help us to scrutinize what is happening within the closed shop of a platform. But moderation obviously is the tool at hand for platforms. So that's why, from my experience, that's why the discussion is about moderation, because the platform offers its service to each and everyone. Of course, if the user agrees to the terms and conditions, but it offers the service to each and everyone. And the only thing how the platform can take an influence on the content is by blocking content, by deleting content, and by not allow users to use the service anymore. So that's why we are obviously always speaking about moderation, because each of these reactions is a kind of moderation, in my understanding. And minimum preventive measures would indeed be, for me, a strong transparency requirement, so strong reporting, so that we can take a look into the decisions. And you mentioned Facebook's report. Well, Facebook's algorithms always make mistakes. So I don't know if it's in the report. So if human oversight or humans correct the decision taken by their filters, but obviously they are making a lot of mistakes, and this is something we need to know. So we shouldn't make the mistake to trust AI more than human beings deciding on content.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump on that? I agree, but on the other hand, I mean, I think an AI system is better than nothing at all. And my take on it is that it's a bit the theory of comparative advantage. If you can come back to Ricardo, where he said, I mean, every country has an advantage and should specialize in that. And I think the difference between human intelligence and AI is, I mean, some are good for some tasks, others are good for other tasks, and we should combine both to get the best result. I really think that's the key issue in AI in general, and in this debate on moderation in particular.
Yeah, I think you know, what else could we have dealing with this kind of level of content, and are we not trying to prevent harm to consumers when it comes to really definitely illegal or very harmful content? If we have AI that is achieving 97-98% accuracy in terms of, you know, paralleling to human flagging, is that not sufficient? And in moderation, can we not also consider, when it comes to other kinds of content that might not be illegal, things like ratings and flaggings and filters that give the consumer the power to protect themselves, which also could be elements of content moderation. We have a question here from the audience that asks, because ERGA, the European Regulators Group, have argued that platforms' liability safe harbors should be made contingent on having safety features, essentially a higher duty of care. And these safety features can include a variety of content moderation measures and things to protect consumers. Is this a good approach? The question asks.
Well, I can start, but then the other may. But yeah, I mean, I think I mean, again, the devil is in the detail. But I mean, the idea of conditioning the liability exemption of having a series of procedures in place, I think it's a good approach, and this is an approach we mentioned in the report. We could say, okay, if you don't have those procedural accountability in place, you cannot benefit from the liability exemption. So I think they should be in place, and if they are not, you should have a condemnation. But I mean, one step further, we would be indeed to condition the liability exemption with those issues in place, infrastructure, if you want, in place, and that may be a good approach, we think, in the report, but I don't know what the other thing.
Werner?
Unmute. I'm not so convinced now to make the liability safe harbor conditional upon the fulfillment of the positive obligations. I think these are probably two things that coexist in a way, because if we are spelling out positive obligations, a provider has to do certain things, has to have in place effective notice and takedown procedures. For some service providers, there would probably be know your customer obligations on marketplaces. There may be obligations for cooperation with authorities and so on. Whatever this list of positive obligations would be, that in itself would be sanctionable. There would have to be penalties attached, right? So if I'm now the home state authority of an operator established on my territory, and they do not have those systems in place, well, the consequence of that is that I will punish those companies, and they will have to, whatever the penalties are. So that's it's an enforcement of any, like any other law that needs to be enforced, right? The liability regime would pretty much stay untouched as it is today, except for some clarifications, meaning that if in spite of the systems that may be fine and you're not punished for systems not being accurate because they're very good, but in spite of everything, there's something illegal on your platform. Someone makes you aware of that, or you find it out yourself. Then as today, you're only shielded from liability for this if you act expeditiously. So the liability stick is still there, that you need to act if something slips through your net, and then you may be exposed to liability. But I would not link the two, because that would be very messy, I think. And then we have long court cases to what extent their obligations have been fulfilled to an extent that you no longer merited the liability exemption. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about legal certainty, I would intuitively rather keep them apart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
So we come back to the accountability rather than...
Yeah, linking both would indeed be very dangerous, and would indeed force platforms to do maybe more than necessary. And whenever platforms are threatened by liability, they of course tend to do, or in some gray area cases, they will of course then do what would limit the liability. And then again, we are back to the discussion on fundamental rights. So Werner is right, there are different platforms, and of course you have to take a different approach. And I don't know, a good selling platform and a video platform, for example. But linking both, I think, would not be helpful.
So I think this proposal for procedural accountability focus is crucial in terms of fundamental rights, and an aspect of that has to be the ability to complain, and as Alex mentioned in his presentation, the ability to turn to a court as a final word, essentially. How would that work in combination with the proposal that is both in Alex's report and in your report, Tiemo, for a European level body? So, you know, I'm wondering if that's not a kind of slippery slope in terms of eroding the country of origin principle and the authority of national courts, etc. That I can see an argument being made there. So how would it work in terms of the...
Well, I don't see a threat to the country of origin principle, and we are making sure to have safeguards in place. I think Alex in IMCO's report and in my report, we are very careful about this. And whenever there is maybe wording which can be misinterpreted, we are trying to make it as clear as possible during the negotiations. So my idea of this independent body is something before a court decision is taken. So the independent dispute settlement body would decide quicker and cheaper for consumers if their content is blocked or taken down, or they don't agree with the decision taken by the platform. But of course, there's always the right to challenge a decision in front of an ordinary court. And this should be the court of the citizen's residence. We just made it clear during yesterday's negotiations for our report. So this is, for me, very important. But even if maybe a European citizen is on vacations, it should be clear that the citizen can use its own court. So that's what we are trying to achieve in my report. But again, so we have this independent dispute settlement body as a quick tool for people to get a decision, and a cheap way to get a decision. But obviously, in the end, you are always allowed to challenge a decision in front of court.
Mm-hmm. Alexander, did you want to come in on that? No? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes left, and we have one question that's just come in. What happens if Europe and the US adopt very different approaches to these platforms? What do we do then?
Well, the ECJ will decide, as we saw today. Well, maybe shortly, because I indeed have to leave at 4 straight, because I have a shadows meeting on my rule of law opinion. Well, what happens if there are different sets of rules? I think we shouldn't water down our rules. So we should be self-confident enough to put in place our rules, and we should defend them. And again, the GDPR has some weaknesses, but it's a masterpiece of data protection. And as we saw today, if our own authorities take it serious, it can be a very sharp sword, very strong tool. And so we shouldn't be worried about US rules.
Okay, thank you. Werner or Alexander? Final responses or final words, as we're down to the last 2 minutes now, Werner?
Yeah, indeed. And like Tiemo, I also have to leave you in 2 minutes sharp. No, but I will fully echo his remarks. I mean, we are defining now a digital policy for Europe. Of course, we are never blind to the rest of the world. We are aware of all the global relationships. We, of course, always do things that are in line with any trade obligations. But here we are talking about services that are being provided on the European market, whether it's a dissemination of products or information or content or what have you. So if we have rules and laws in place that we want to make sure that our laws are upheld, I think that's a natural thing to do for us. But I don't even see such a great risk, because I have a sense that in the US and in Europe, there is increasing convergence also in recognizing some of the challenges in the online world that need to be tackled. So I don't really see us on 2 different planets here.
Okay. Thank you very much. On that note, I want to thank Werner, Alexander, Tiemo very much for this interesting discussion. This is certainly not the end of these discussions. Hopefully we'll be talking a lot more between now and the end of the year, when we have a draft DSA in our hands. And I wish you all good luck with the rest of your activities for the day. And thank you very much for all of you who are listening and watching.